Welcome, everyone. I'm Jeffrey Goodman, Director of Marketing and Development for the YMCA of Northwest Louisiana. We're here at 318 Latino Studios for Shreveport-Bossier, my city, my community, my home. And we're going to have a new discussion today, which I'm super excited to have. Our guest is Chris Brown. Chris, thanks for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Of course, of course. Well, we're going to hop into your world. Your day job, and if I get any of this wrong, please correct me, but you're the archivist of Centenary College and the Louisiana United Methodist Church.
Correct, yeah. Day to day, 9 to 5, I'm working at Centenary College, managing the institutional archives, and also we serve as the archival repository for the Louisiana Conference of the United Methodist Church. So people are coming to me with questions about when stuff happened in Centenary's past or when stuff happened in the world of Methodism within Louisiana, and also working with administrators transferring material that they create to the archives. These days more electronic records, but still a lot of paper stuff too. So yeah, and I help researchers tap into that.
Okay, and today we're gonna really focus in on a hobby of yours. So this is me talking, but I don't know anyone in our community who knows more about the history of music in Shreveport than you do. So my question for you is, or I guess questions is, when did your interest in Shreveport's music history start? And second part of that is just what motivates you to continue unearthing it?
Sure. So the Shreveport music history hobby that has gobbled up so much of my time for the past probably 20 years has been kind of a combination of my interest in music, first of all, and my interest in local history. And the music part came from, like as a high school kid, I would listen to Centenary's radio station because I was trying to tap into kind of like weirder outsider music, and holy moly, in 1995, that was like a gold mine for things you could not hear anywhere else. And when I was in high school, I started hanging out at that radio station. And then when I chose to attend Centenary, I was heavily involved with the radio station, working there, volunteering there, and did so for like 18 or 19 years, something like that.
And this is KSCL?
This is, KSCL 91.3 FM. Yeah. And so I hosted that radio show. I was collecting records. I was always really into music. And probably a couple of years after I graduated Centenary, like around 2003-ish, I graduated college in 2001. A couple of years after that, I had already been interested in local history. There were a handful of like Eric Brock books that had been published that I had purchased, some books by Willie Burton focusing more on the Black history of Shreveport. So I enjoyed learning more about stuff that was happening right in my own backyard.
Let me interrupt one second.
Yeah.
So who got you, like, I know your grandfather was Charles Ellis Brown.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Who first got you, like, who introduced you to Eric Brock, or who introduced you to Willie Burton? Like, who, because I'm 50 now. I'm reading a Willie Burton book right now. I never read Willie Burton growing up. I never read Eric Brock. So I'm always curious, like, who first got you looking in that direction or interested about just our local history?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm trying to guess. I think with the Eric Brock stuff, it was just going to like bookstores around town that had a little section of local history books. And some were like historical text telling you the history of the city. And then some that Eric created were like pictorial histories. And I remember really enjoying looking at old photographs. So it may have been some of those that I gravitated toward first. I also have a memory of proctoring a praxis teacher's test at Centenary, because I did that for a couple of years, helping out the registrar's office do those. And I was there proctoring a test and also reading a book. And it was a Willie Burton book. And I remember buying it at D&B Russell's bookstore that was across the street from Centenary. And how that even popped up on my radar, I can't remember. Oh, wait, I think I do remember. When I was a Centenary student, my senior research project that I focused on for a year. I wrote a paper. It got published in a history journal. It was about the origins of Booker T. Washington High School. And my professor, Sam Shepard, in the history department at Centenary, was like, you need to look at Willie Burton's book to see what he wrote about the beginnings of Booker T. Washington. So that's how I would have been exposed to Willie Burton's book. And then his book that originally came out in the 80s was republished a couple of times. And I think around that 2001, 2, something like that, that memory that I have of reading that book was I just went across the street and bought the book because it was like, oh, they republished it again. I don't have a copy. I'd like to get a copy of that. So yeah, I had this interest in music. I had this interest in local history. And just one day, it was almost like a light bulb was turned on. It was like, I wonder what music from Shreveport's past sounds like. And I remember around that same time watching the John Waters movie Hairspray, and that came out in like the late 80s. And there was a scene where they featured a musician from Monroe who released some records with Stan Lewis here in Shreveport. And it was like, that's interesting that this guy in this national movie is from North Louisiana. So I remember mail ordering on Amazon like 2 or 3 CDs. It was like a compilation of rhythm and blues music from the 60s and 70s that Stan released. And then there were 2 compilations released on British record labels. And that's kind of an interesting story in and of itself of like people from outside Shreveport kind of continuing this, keeping that music alive. But there was a compilation of soul music from the Mirko record label run by Dee Marais. And there was also a compilation of music that Mira Smith recorded. So I remember mail ordering those CDs and getting them in the mail, like, again, around 2003, and thinking, wow, I've never heard of any of this music before. And all of it was going on right here in Shreveport. Let me just start digging and learn some more and learn some more and learn some more. And it was like this never-ending exploration that continues to this day. So that was kind of how it all came together. I was doing a radio show at the same time. And so I would sometimes feature some of that music as I would discover it on the radio show. Occasionally there'd be like some celebration honoring a local musician, like in the local scene, and like it's Stan Lewis Day or it's James Burton Festival or something. So on my radio show, I'd just pull together a whole bunch of music that those people released and highlight that on a show. Occasionally, I would have musicians or record label owners actually on the show and interview them. I did that maybe 10 times over the years.
And tell people because I recently, as I was preparing for today's discussion, you have some pretty amazing stuff out there on the internet for people to find. So just tell people where they can both find these interviews that you conducted back in the day, and then maybe some of this historical work. I mean, we're going to get into all kind of things, but just some of this historical work that you've done through the years where they can access that.
Yeah, so for anybody interested in this stuff, there is a blog where I've uploaded stuff over the years. I'll say it's not super active right now, but you can get to a wealth of recordings on there. And if you just Google Shreveport songs, that should get you there. So there's a website that contains more kind of like historical info, images, and then links out to playlists where you can listen to stuff. The stuff to listen to is hosted on a website called Mixcloud, M-I-X Cloud. So I think it's like shreveportsongs.mixcloud.com, something like that.
And talk a little bit about how these compilations came about, just what they were and...
So again, around this time, early 2000s, me buying a handful of CDs and learning some about this music, I thought, this is fascinating. Like, I hadn't heard of these things before. There's way more out there than I was aware of. And I bet my friends would enjoy this too. So once a year for 10 or 12 years, for around Christmas time, I would just make a homemade mix CD of songs connected to Shreveport and give those out as Christmas presents. And eventually, I started putting them online on that Mixcloud website. So for each of those physical CDs that were created back in the day, you can actually just stream that and listen to that volume or that mix of music.
Yeah, they're incredible. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's either songs that were recorded in Shreveport or songs that were recorded by someone who originated from Shreveport, or I can't remember.
Or songs that somehow mention the word Shreveport in their lyrics.
Right.
So yeah, there is some connection one way or another to all that music.
Okay, and I can't recommend this enough. It's this treasure trove of our past that I don't think anyone else that I know of has ever done that kind of work.
Yeah, one thing that I tried to do with that, and one reason that I continue to be interested in this topic is just, I don't really care what style of music it is. So these compilations really cut across a bunch of genres. And normally when I interact with other folks who may have lived some of this, because heck, I was born in 1979, so much of this is before I existed. But if I'm interacting with those people who lived it and were musicians, or even like record label collectors scattered around the globe, a lot of people are kind of like in a specific genre. They're like in their little world of jazz music or blues or country or gospel or whatever. I mean, there's cross-pollination for sure. But what I tried to do with those compilations is like, let me throw it all together. So this will be as eclectic as possible. So it was everything from like, one of those compilations might start off with 1920s blues, then be like 1930s country western swing, then eventually make it to like 1940s black gospel, and then 1950s country music, and then 1960s soul, and then 1970s like funk, 1980s punk rock. I mean, it's all over the place. So,
and would you say, I mean, I don't want to kind of put a thesis on what you just said, but would you say, and that's kind of who we are?
Yeah, for sure. It's a big old melting pot. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that Shreveport has created. And it's interesting because people have asked me over the years, like, what does Shreveport sound like? And I mean, you can make generalizations about, oh, there's this rich soul music scene here for a while, or this rich country music scene. But at the same time, you can pretty much find an example of a style of music that was popular nationally, somehow echoing a version of that from a Shreveporter or somebody connected to Shreveport, regardless of genre.
To follow that up, I mean, if one conversation we've had, and you and I talked a little bit about this in advance of today's discussion, one conversation we've had a lot on this podcast is just, who is Shreveport? Like, what is our identity, period? Like, if someone met you on the street and had never been to Shreveport, never heard about it, and just asked you, what's it like, or just what is Shreveport, what would your response be if someone said, what is Shreveport's musical identity? Like, if you had to kind of answer that question, just how would you describe that in addition to what you just said?
Yeah, so there are a few ways that I think of answering that. One is kind of Shreveport as a crossroads of different people maybe passing through town and interacting who live here for a while and then move on. And I also think about like certain genres of music that it's like, oh, there's a whole bunch of country music that existed in the 40s, 50s, and 60s from around here. And shoot, there was another part of that just escaped. Let's see if it comes back in a minute. I have totally lost that.
No problem. I love all that.
Oh, and it was a good one too. Maybe it'll come back in a little bit.
It wasn't about the jazz of the 30s. It wasn't about the hayride. It wasn't about...
I'm totally drawing a blank.
It's all good.
Oh, yes. Now I remember. Another thing that I would tell people is what I kind of humorously called to some of my friends like the big three songs from Shreveport that had a life outside of the city. Like if you've ever heard some song connected to Shreveport, it's one of these three. It's either something by Leadbelly, probably Goodnight Irene or Rock Island Line, like his version of that. But I think Goodnight Irene would be the bigger one. the next big song, Holy Moly, You Are My Sunshine, Jimmy Davis living here and writing, or acquiring that song, because that's a story. And the third one would be Dale Hawkins' Susie Q that was recorded just a couple blocks away from here in the downtown KWKH studio after hours at nighttime. So yeah, for most people, it's like if you have heard one of these songs, you've heard something connected to Shreveport.
I love that.
Yeah.
Where was the downtown KWKH studio? Do you know?
In an old bank building that I can't remember the name, that they've renovated multiple times. It was offices. These days, there's some loft apartments in it. White building, that direction,
Okay.
if that rings a bell.
Okay.
It's one of the older multi-story buildings downtown. Probably 8-10 stories, something like that.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna shift you for a sec. So now we've glanced on a few historical figures, but I want you, and I've heard you speak about all three of these people before. You gave this, and I'll recommend this to anyone who wants more information after they listen to the podcast. You gave this extraordinary talk to the Rotary Club a few years ago. But I want you to, and it was about these three figures. I want you to choose 2 of 3 of the following key figures that from our musical past that you focused on in your Rotary presentation. I want you to talk about 2 out of the 3 of them, and they are Mira Smith, Dee Marais, and Stan Lewis. And I'm going to let you kind of decide who you want to tell us about.
Sure. All of those are giants in the world of Shreveport music history. Stan created a huge empire that stretched beyond what anybody else created. Mira was doing really cutting-edge stuff as a woman in the world of music, both as a songwriter and record label owner, and she also ran a recording studio. She was like the triple or quadruple threat, this real Renaissance woman. And then Harding Guion Dee Marais, a.k.a. Dee Marais, really tapped into what Black rhythm and blues soul music in Shreveport sounds like in the 1960s. I think if I would just choose 2 of them, I'd talk about Mira and Dee because they get a little less attention than Stan does. But holy moly, all of them did awesome stuff. Mira's story starts in the, I guess, early 1950s, maybe even late 40s. And a lot of this that I learned, because Mira died in, I think, 1989, a lot of this I learned through her cousin, Alton Warwick, who apparently grew up pretty much in the same house as her. I think Alton may have lost a parent at a young age, so he moved in with Mira's parents. Or maybe it was the other way around. I can't remember that, like Mira's parents, one of them died. In any event, they grew up closely together. So a lot of this information I got from Alton. And then Alton married a longtime collaborator of Mira's, Margaret Lewis. And so I've had Alton and Margaret on my radio show around 2005 to interview them and talk to them about this stuff. And I remember like visiting them in their offices in that old KWKH building. They were on a different floor. Just going through some of the old files that Alton's cousin Mira had created over the years. But so that's where I get a lot of this information. But Mira started in the late 40s. I think first she began as just a musician and also a songwriter, and started a songwriting club of just other people who are getting together, hanging out and writing songs together and kind of playing them for each other. Very informal thing. And then that grows, and eventually she ends up releasing records by pretty young kids from Shreveport who were tapping into originally like mid 50s, like circa 1955-ish country music. And a lot of these people overlapped with the Louisiana Hayride activities that were taking place at the same time. The thing was, there really wasn't a formal recording studio in the city of Shreveport before Mira created one. There were recordings that happened in Shreveport, but the vast majority of them were at radio stations after hours. Like the station signs off at midnight or 1 a.m. or whatever, and then signs back on maybe at 6 in the morning. So you got this window of opportunity in the middle of the night where people are actually working with the radio station's engineer to record songs. But what Mira created was just a studio where you could book time, and it could be as informal as you can imagine, like some little kid playing piano, and they cut like a instantaneous disc that you can take home and listen to. Be the equivalent of like recording something on your phone today and playing it back later, but it's on a one-of-a-kind disc that you create just right there in real time. So she created that sort of infrastructure to, you can book time and come to this studio.
And where was it?
And record stuff. Originally on Lakeshore, and then it moved to Greenwood Road. And that Greenwood Road location is really close to the Louisiana State Exhibit Museum, like across the street. It's now a Creole catering restaurant. Yeah. It's kind of like 2 or 3 doors of a building internally separated, and Mira had a couple of them. And at that location on Greenwood, she was running a recording studio, working with local and touring musicians who just booked time with her. She was also releasing some of that music on her own record label called Ram, and it had this logo of a ram's head drawn on it. And she was also running a record store for a little while there, selling records she released, but also selling just popular records at the time. So there are photographs that were taken inside that store, and you can see like a display for the new Elvis single is out, you can buy it, or, stuff like that. But yeah, so Mira created this recording studio, originally started releasing country music. Then she started collaborating with some other people to do rhythm and blues music, both by white musicians and black musicians. One of my favorite songs was recorded at her studio, and it's by a drummer named Chico Chisholm, and the song is called Hot Tamales and Barbecue. And the lyrics are just like this entertaining list of food, and it keeps mentioning Texas Avenue. Hot Tamales and Barbecue on Texas Avenue. When you get a song that has some like fun lyrics and repeated references to something in Shreveport, that totally skyrockets my interest in it. But yeah, Mira was doing some really interesting stuff. And so she released probably 20 records over maybe 5 or 6 years. These were all singles, one song on each side of a 45. And they've later been compiled by a British record label. Like I mentioned earlier, it's interesting because the reissue music market is heavily driven by overseas record labels. Part of that has to do with copyright issues. They're licensing it and paying royalties on it. But things are a little bit different in Europe than they are in the US. And also just this, I guess, interest for things kind of like on the other, side of the fence, on the other side of the ocean.
This is kind of a strange question, but do you have any idea, like, how does this British record label that decides to re-release Ram record singles, like, how do they, what is their process for even discovering those to begin with? Like, how does that hit their radar?
I think it's largely driven through record collectors and people who are heavily focused on a particular style of music. Like, just the network of worldwide record collectors who are really into blues music or really into soul music, who seek that out everywhere. And if it's stuff like soul music, you got stuff that pretty much anybody knows, like Motown or Stax Records in Memphis. But then you have like collectors who are into the hyper obscure. And I wouldn't necessarily say that Shreveport is like hyper obscure, because there are way more obscure things out there, of like someone who released like 1 or 2 records out of their house, and that was the extent of it. But you just have people who love certain types of music, and it's a never-ending quest to hear more of it. So I think that's largely how it pops up on their radar. Like, hey, we've reissued a ton of country music, and that is our mission, to reissue 1950s country music. And just at some point, you get to artists who are associated with Shreveport.
So, like, I can go to Mixcloud, is that what it's called? Your site, and I can listen to a lot of what we're going to talk about today. Can can I dial some of this up on Spotify too?
Yeah, you should be able to Google, like search for any of this stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
And can I also, so these British labels, could I actually go online and order some of this?
Definitely. Yeah,
Okay.
they're, physical CDs, or you could, buy the song on iTunes or whatever for $1. So yeah, most all this stuff is pretty readily available at this point in time. Doing this back in 2004 felt a lot more like just waiting around in the dark trying to find some of this. But yeah, with just the revolution of music online, a lot of this stuff is on YouTube. A lot of this stuff, like I said, you can buy either physical CDs. And often these reissue labels put a ton of energy into these elaborate, like, insert booklets that might be anywhere from a dozen to 50 pages long. And it's like, how the heck did they even stuff this in the jewel case, the little CD container? And it's interviews with the musicians, photographs of them. Just
all right, I wasn't going to go here today, but I think this is noteworthy. So just share just a quick tidbit about your involvement with the Louisiana Hayride 20 CD booklet or 20 CD
box set
that ended up, I think, winning a Grammy.
I think it was nominated for one.
Okay, nominated for a Grammy.
Yeah, when I hear of record labels, like, here's a project that we're working on, this should be coming out in the next year or something like that. Whenever I hear of those types of things, I try to reach out to them if I have stuff about those artists to say, like, hey, I'm over here. I got these cool photographs, or I interviewed this person. How can I be of help? Because, I mean, shoot, you got boots on the ground in Shreveport as opposed to a guy in London writing the story. And yes, they can do an awesome job, but just the interactions I've had over the years in collecting this stuff for like 20 years, it's like, here's this weird little photograph that not many people have seen. You want to include it? Or, hey, I got this great interview with this person and they've since passed away. Feel free to use whatever quotes you want out of it. So when I hear about those projects taking place, I try to reach out to them. And the Hayride one was a similar story. That's a record label in Germany that has released a lot of country music, Bear Family Records. And they had done these elaborate box sets for a number of artists, but they had also done elaborate box sets on country music kind of variety type shows in the past that were a big thing in the 1950s and 60s. And when I heard that they were working with Alton and Margaret, who have long been champions of the Hayride and have a bunch of stuff on the Hayride, and Margaret was on the Hayride as a performer, I just reached out to Bear Family too, saying like, hey, I have stuff also if you're interested in it. And their response was like, oh yes, what do you have? We're interested in a list of things. Or I remember just like laying stuff out on a coffee table and like taking pictures and then emailing it to them and like, what do you need a high resolution scan of? So,
and a lot of it ended up.
Yeah. And also proofreading the book. That one is really exhaustive. And it comes with a book that I think is like 150 or 200 pages long. It's like a hardback book that fits inside of a box, along with 10 CDs that are all live Hayride recordings. And just, again, being a person who lives here, proofing something written by a person who doesn't live here, who it's like, hey, you got the name of the street wrong. Or actually, you named this business and it's supposed to be this other one. And just like, hey, let's try to make this as good as we can and get the details right.
Let's be accurate.
Yeah, exactly. Let's be accurate.
All right, so shift me now to
Back
Mirko and Dee Marais.
Gotcha. Oh man, but can I add one more thing
you
about
can add whatever
hopping
you want.
back to Mira?
Yeah,
so
totally.
So she's doing her stuff from the middle 50s to about the early 60s. And then she moves up to Nashville. I think they moved somewhere else, for maybe Las Vegas for a little while first. She and Margaret both, because they have been super duper collaborators at this point here in Shreveport.
Margaret, who a lot of people know as Maggie. Is
correct. Maggie Warwick, a.k.a. Margaret Lewis originally. Yes. So Mira and Margaret end up in Nashville going to work as songwriters. And they collaborate with another Shreveport guy, Shelby Singleton, who's moved up to Nashville. you see a lot of Shreveport people move up to Nashville if they're in the country music world during the 50s and 60s. But they're working with Shelby. They're writing songs. They're pitching them to some of the musicians on Shelby's record label. And their names are just scattered all over the place in 1960s and 70s, like country and rhythm and blues music that Shelby was releasing. And there's some awesome songs that these two white ladies from Shreveport wrote that's like this deep soul ballad that this, singer from New Orleans might be singing, like the song Reconsider Me by Johnny Adams that Myra and Margaret wrote. Or like stuff that appears on the Harper Valley PTA soundtrack was originally written by Myra and Margaret and shows up as some of the other songs on that. Not soundtrack, but Harper Valley PTA LP by Jeannie C. Riley. I think later they made like a weird movie out of it, but first it was just the record. And so I'm trying to think, it seemed like there was another song that they wrote. But yeah, they just end up in Nashville writing all these songs. And then eventually they end up moving back to Shreveport, I think in the mid or early 80s, something like that. They also wrote songs for Linda Martell, who's seen as one of the early examples of a black woman singing country music in the 1960s. So folks like the new Beyonce record is referencing, like reviews to it talk about people like Linda Martell, who recorded that style of music in the 1960s. Half of the songs on Linda Martell's LP were written by Myra and Margaret when they're living up in Nashville. So all these connections to Shreveport that kind of run throughout music culture. So yeah, that's what you got on Myra. Now shifting gears to Dee Marais. So Dee was originally from Minnesota, and then ends up in Louisiana around World War II or right after World War II. He's working some with country musicians, and I think Dee's living in Alexandria, Louisiana, in the middle of the state at this point. He's working with a handful of country musicians. He releases he partners with another guy to found a record label called Mirko. They did some stuff before Mirko too that was country. Some of it was 1950s, 60s rhythm and blues. But what Mirko is mainly known for is soul music from about 1966 to like 1970-ish. And then it kind of shift gears as just the flavor of that style of music shifts from like soul to funk music. And that picks up on their record label too. But with the soul music, so again, that guy Shelby Singleton that moved up to Nashville, Shelby starts a record store called the Bayou Record Shop on 70th Street in Cedar Grove neighborhood. And then Shelby moves away to Nashville and sells the record store to Dee Marais. So Dee had been releasing some music by other artists around the state. Then Dee moves to Shreveport. He buys this record store. Shelby moves away. And he's at this record store in a predominantly black neighborhood in the 1960s. And Dee starts making connections with young people in that community who are musicians or aspiring musicians. And some of them have begun to like play at nightclubs around town.
Do you have any idea how he's connecting with them? Do you have any idea?
I assume they're just customers walking into his store, and then word of mouth from there. Kind of like Myra is heavily plugged into the scene of musicians at Fair Park High School. And that's people like Joe Osborne, James Burton, Linda Brannon, Jerry Kennedy. All of those were like white kids going to Fair Park who were involved in country and then kind of like a rockabilly style of music. Dee is heavily plugged into the Cedar Grove neighborhood. And it's people like Eddie Giles and Dory Grayson and Abraham Esther. And these people just had like small bands, standard, like a singer, a drummer, a bass player, a guitarist. And they would perform at nightclubs around town. And Dee started releasing records by them. Some songs that they wrote and recorded themselves, and some songs that Dee would help them write or that Dee wrote the lyrics to and then had them record.
Are these integrated bands at this time? Are these
They're pretty segregated. Most of the groups that Dee works with are either black groups or who are like black rhythm and blues groups or soul music, or white rock and roll groups or white country bands. There's not a whole bunch of kind of racial, cross-racial mixing in the music scene on those recordings until you get to the early 70s, that I'm familiar with at least. And that's more around of a whole different scene in the Sound City recording studio that was near Byrd High School. And that's kind of shifting things to about 1972-ish. But where Dee is doing all of his recordings, like I mentioned earlier, Mira's like the only one in town who has a recording studio that you can book time at. She's already moved away by the point Dee comes around. So Dee is buying time over at a cutting-edge recording studio in Tyler, Texas, Robin Bryan's recording studio that still exists to this day. And at that studio, Robin just released thousands and thousands of recordings that appeared as records later on. Like early ZZ Top records were recorded over there. But so Dee buys time at this recording studio that Bryan has built as kind of an addition onto the back of his parents' house, just like in a neighborhood in Tyler, Texas. And so both Dee as well as people like Stan Lewis are having their artists drive to an hour and a half to Tyler, Texas to record in like the best studio within an hour and a half drive. And Dee is working with these young kids or people in their early 20s as well who are from that Cedar Grove neighborhood. Eddie Giles has a big hit early on with a song called Losing Boy that makes a national splash at the time. And I imagine that a lot of the funds that were produced from that recording kind of went to then support another, half dozen years of Mirko records. But Eddie Giles made a whole bunch of records, about probably 7 or 8. And all of these are singles. In some of those other individuals I mentioned, like Abraham, Esther, and the Casanovas, they made a handful of singles. Dory Grayson makes a handful of records too. But yeah, it's just like if you want to hear soul music from Shreveport, Mirko was the one who was capturing it. Curiously, Stan Lewis, who's that third person, who has like the biggest impact running like this record store empire and record label empire, Stan is not working heavily with local music groups. He's working with a lot of groups who are scattered around the country. I mean, there are some that are local that he works with or regional that he works with, but you think of like the biggest hits that Stan had, it would be like Judy in Disguise from John Fred and the Playboys out of Baton Rouge. But there was probably a good 10-year period where Stan was farming out Shreveport-related musicians to other record labels through connections that he had by running the store. So sending people like Dale Hawkins and that song Susie Q up to Chicago to get released on Stan's friend's record label, Checker Records, Leonard Chess, who runs that. So, yeah. And Mirko does kind of change with the times, like I mentioned earlier, shifting from kind of rhythm and blues to soul and then like harder edge funk stuff. Think things that were inspired by like James Brown or the Meters from New Orleans. Yeah, there's some really awesome recordings that came out on Mirko.
Yeah, I had never even heard of Mirko or anything about Shreveport's soul legacy until I started digging into you and trying to get ready to have today's conversation. And so
there's some really fun songs out there. Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna shift you. So you mentioned this gentleman earlier, but now, if you wouldn't mind, give me some history of Leadbelly and talk to me a little, if you could, just about his worldwide importance.
Sure. So Hootie Ledbetter, aka Leadbelly, is from North Caddo Parish near Mooringsport. He's buried at a church there. And as a kid, he was growing up in the country, basically. His parents owned a farm. But growing up in that area in the first 2 decades of 1900, he's exposed to music, just through people he interacts with in that community, as well as people at church. And the reason that he is coming to Shreveport is that at that point in time, Shreveport had a legalized, decriminalized red light district. So there were dozens and dozens of brothels just at the edge of downtown, kind of behind First Methodist Church. And there would be saloon bars that supported that line of work as well, and just that entertainment kind of district. And Leadbelly talks about being a teenager, coming with his dad to Shreveport, his dad is coming to buy stuff or sell stuff that they grow on the farm, and passing through that neighborhood and just being really curious about what is this whole neighborhood all about. At that point in time, it was referred to as St. Paul's Bottoms because there was St. Paul's Methodist Episcopal Church in that neighborhood. And that church has since moved. It's still in operation as one of the oldest black churches in town, St. Paul's United Methodist Church. But in any event, Leadbelly is exposed to this neighborhood, then starts talking about, and this is documented in interviews that he's done, as well as some songs that he wrote specifically about his experiences and exposure to that neighborhood. And it was his dad. He was going with his dad to town. He saw that this was a place that had music that he was interested in and just people having fun. And he was curious about that. So he would go back to that neighborhood if he had the chance to break away from his dad or just leave home and travel to Shreveport. And so he was exposed. These would be people playing piano, as well as some guitar players. I mean, Leadbelly you associate with as being a guitar player, though he also played accordion. And there's some recordings of that out there. But yeah, and Leadbelly was like a musical sponge. Just, it seemed anything that he heard, he was going to include into his repertoire. And Leadbelly, like I said, grows up in that North Caddo Parish region. And then at some point, he moves to East Texas, just on the state line, basically. So maybe 20 miles from his house where he grew up. And he's in that area for a little while. Leadbelly is arrested multiple times and goes to jail a handful of times. One of them that happens, I guess this would be in the 1920s or 30s, something. I'm fuzzy on the date exactly. But he's in jail, and now I'm even drawing a blank if this is at Angola one time in South Louisiana near Baton Rouge, or if this is in Texas, Sugar Land, which is a big prison outside of Houston. At one of those places, and maybe both of them, he interacts with some traveling people. Alan Lomax, who's the younger guy, Alan's dad is John Lomax, working for the Library of Congress, recording folk music, folk songs. And the rationale of the Lomaxes, who were then stationed in Texas, because John Lomax worked at UT Austin for a number of years, traveling around the South, trying to find the most unpolluted folk music possible. We don't want inspiration from popular music of the day. We're trying to get the most pure folk music that has no modern influences out there. So their rationale was, well, we're going to go to where people have been stuck for sometimes decades. We're going to go find people who play music in prisons because they would have retained an older style of music that we can record and document. Here's what music sounded like in the past.
And for those, let me just interject. For those of you that don't know, I mean, probably this work done by the Lomaxes, I mean, is incredibly important in the history of 20th century, in the history of music, period.
Yeah, yeah. And you can listen to pretty much all this online now through the Library of Congress. So Leadbelly was introduced to them just as they were showing up at a prison to say to the warden or the guards, who are your musicians here? We want to record some of them. And they meet Leadbelly. And eventually that interaction leads to him being hired as their chauffeur, for lack of a better word, because he would drive them around. And he worked with them for a number of years. And what Leadbelly would do with the Lomaxes is they would continue to go to other places to record musicians. Sometimes prisons, but I mean, it wasn't all prisons. And Leadbelly would maybe play some of his songs that would get recorded, or just, like, I imagine, start conversations with, hey, where are some musicians in this community? Because they might just as likely rent out some rooms. And this is something they did here in Shreveport and dozens of other communities around the country. Rent out a couple of hotel rooms, try to soundproof them as best as possible, bring their recording instruments up there, which must have been a complete pain because we're talking about really heavy equipment into a hotel room that might be up a flight of stairs or whatever, and just put a call out to who are some musicians that would be interested in coming to record some songs for us. We're, documenting what music sounds like. And they would often try to interact with like older musicians, again, trying to get older styles of music that had not been preserved. Because think at the same time, people like maybe Cab Calloway doing like swing and jazz would be at the forefront of most people's mind. And what they're talking about is trying to get to something that's more archaic, like a guy or girl just strumming a guitar, singing a song that they may have heard from their grandparents as they worked, or something like that. So Leadbelly works with the Lomaxes. They're traveling around, interacting with musicians so that they can record more of this music. Leadbelly ends up moving to New York, and his wife, Martha, who's also from the Shreveport area, she moves up there with him. And Leadbelly gets really plugged into the folk music scene of the 1940s and 50s. And these would be people like Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger, who were just really interested in old folk music, basically. And there's this whole scene around that's happening, largely in the Northeast. And I guess later it turns into like kind of folk hootenanny shows in the 1960s with like the Kingston Trio and stuff like that. But like Pete Seeger's early band, The Weavers, does a recording of the Leadbelly song Goodnight Irene to further popularize it. And shoot, Leadbelly songs have had such an impression on those folk singers who were like a generation or more younger than Leadbelly. So these were like white folk musicians looking up to this older black guy from the backwoods of Louisiana as like, holy moly, he's the real deal. We like this style of music, and here it is coming from this guy who lived this rough life and has songs that document these regions. So Leadbelly songs get picked up by them. Then they get picked up like in the 1960s with like rock and roll bands covering Leadbelly songs. And there were a lot of songs that Leadbelly recorded that were just like kind of not necessarily things that he wrote, but just kind of filtered through the popular consciousness of musicians of that era who were like borrowing songs from each other, or even like kind of like vaudeville sheet music songs that you might go to the theater and hear a version of this. And now, though maybe in the 1890s, and here Leadbelly is doing his version of it 20 years later. And here we are like in the 1960s with some British rock band doing their cover, like Led Zeppelin doing a song that Leadbelly originally recorded. Or even later on, folks like Nirvana doing a song that Leadbelly originally recorded.
Or Bob Dylan.
Oh, yeah.
During his acceptance lecture, or whatever it's called formally, for his Nobel Prize, citing the importance of Leadbelly on his own musical growth. So I'm gonna pause you there.
And people like the Beatles cite Leadbelly as an influence. So yeah, he had a huge impact.
So that kind of brings me to my final formal question. I will come back to you after this, but you probably don't know this about me, but about 7 years ago, along with a couple other people, I brought back the city tennis tournament because it had died, and because I thought it was important for us to continue to have it because it was rich with history and a critical part of our local sports past. A history, by the way, that we seem to take for granted and so unconcerned with protecting and preserving. So my last formal question for you today is, I'd like you to discuss the following, and the question is, why do we struggle? This is my opinion. I don't know if you agree with this, but why do we struggle as a city at knowing, preserving, and rallying around with pride our city's rich musical past?
Yeah, that's a great question, and probably one that has a wide variety of answers. I think part of it is that some of these individuals originally from Shreveport later moved to other cities where they felt like they could earn more money or have bigger impact or more connections, that they tried in Shreveport, and Shreveport was kind of like a stepping stone for them. So I guess when you get people moving away, it's kind of breaks a line of continuity. Certainly people have tried to create music museums before, and some have even existed for a while. I remember Dan Garner's efforts at the what they were calling the Louisiana Hayride Diner in the old department store across the street from the courthouse on Texas Street. And Dan was doing some really cool stuff where they would hand out awards to musicians or record label owners and collect some stuff from them and put it on display. I also think about how the Municipal Auditorium, that was the location of the Louisiana Hayride from 1948 on into the late 1960s, that they had some display areas showing off memorabilia, photographs, stuff about musicians who were part of the Hayride history. And then I know like folks like these days, Scott Auer at Little Shop of Music is working to create a local music history museum. So it's not that no one has ever tried, but it's like nothing has ever really stuck. I think another part of the answer might be that in the world of entertainment, there is a lot of collaboration, to be sure, but there's also a lot of competition. So some people are not close friends, even though they've done business before. So, and I guess, celebrating that legacy is not trying to get those folks to work together, because some of these people have long since passed away. But I think there is a level of competition that makes pulling it all together and celebrating it in some ways a stumbling block.
Give me an example. I'm not sure can you give me an example without...
Well, just people who were involved in the music industry who felt like others that they worked with were taking advantage of them, or that they had business deals with that they weren't happy with, stuff like that.
Okay.
And that's speculation on my part about why that may have been, harder to celebrate that legacy. But when you have people that aren't necessarily close friends, that might be part of the reason. Other reasons?
Because it's interesting. I'm going to interrupt for one sec. So my wife and I were recently, my mom's from the Delta. My wife and I recently went to Greenwood, Mississippi. Mm-hmm. And we stayed there for a couple nights. You park your car downtown Greenwood. I don't know what the population of Greenwood is, but I'm just guessing somewhere 20,000 people or less. You park your car in Greenwood, Mississippi. You step out of your car, and there are these these like domes all along downtown Greenwood with music coming out of them 24/7, and it's music that has some association with Greenwood, Mississippi. And you step out of your car and you immediately feel like I'm in a place that has a rich history and is aware of it and is proud to flaunt it. Mm-hmm. And I just struggle and wonder, like, why we can't at least get there.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I visited Greenwood probably around 2012, and I remember you can throw a rock and hit a building that is somehow either celebrating music history, like at this hotel, or it's a bar that still has live music, or it's, you know, someplace where something interesting happened and there's a sign outside. And yeah, you don't see that around Shreveport. I mean, I guess part of it is also just who has the finances and the vision and is willing to fight that uphill battle. And that hasn't quite happened in Shreveport yet.
As someone who, I mean, as the person who I consider, I mean, this isn't a fair question really, but as someone who I consider the foremost authority on Shreveport's musical past, I mean, do you feel like that uphill battle, I mean, I know you've been fighting it kind of in your own way, but I mean, do you feel like we do have a past that's worth preserving and that is a uphill battle worth fighting? That,
oh yeah, 100%. I mean, at least I think it's really interesting to hear music that was created right here in our community and also see the reverberations of how that affected things outside Shreveport. I mean, I think that's really fascinating. And what does someone who was from Shreveport sound like 100 years ago? I can click this button and find out. I think that's really interesting. But yeah, I guess someone with deep enough pockets, or, I mean, another thing that I see some folks do, and this is not like pointing fingers at anybody individually, but like instead of incremental steps in growing something, like we're going to aim for the moon first. And then you try that and it doesn't work and it just completely falls apart. So maybe someone, and I guess any sort of project has very like blue sky, big picture people, and then others who are like in the details and working on like incremental steps, moving things forward. And you got to get that magic connection of both of those and some people with money to, you know, put all of it together to make it happen.
But I feel like, I mean, would you agree with these two statements? I feel like our musical past, A, is an important part of our identity, and B, in a town that often struggles with pride and self-esteem, it's an area that we can be really proud about.
Yeah, I 100% on both of those. I think that there is a rich history to celebrate, and yeah, I mean it's there. You just got to tap into it, and it's not that hard to tap into it these days. I also think about just like a larger story of like you say, Shreveport celebrating its own identity, music or not, or like what are the histories that have been written and told about Shreveport. And I think the city just kind of struggles in general with documenting its past and knowing what happened and where it came from as it plans to move into the future and what it's going to do next.
And what last, and then I'll come back to see if there's anything else you want. So that statement you just made, why do you think we have such a hard time documenting our past? Like, why is that such a struggle for us? Why is it so easy for us to just let all of that go by the wayside?
That's a good question. And this is from someone who works in an archives that helps people tap into the past. Why? I mean, maybe just folks are preoccupied with things that are more important in their lives. Might be the answer at the end of the day. Yeah. I guess you have to have this combination of someone with that interest who's going to devote that time and energy to it. And certainly a lot of people have over the years. But it seems like it's often more folks working in silos rather than kind of collaborating together. And some of those silos have done awesome work, but when they're driven by just one or two people who are doing something, one or two people can't do stuff forever. And that project might just kind of fizzle out when those people lose interest, move away, pass away. Yeah, I guess those are some of the reasons that come to my mind.
Yeah, I agree with all that. Well, I know there's some other things you're involved in. My other kind of off-subject question is, would you ever write a book? Like, is that ever crossed your mind? Is that a project that you would ever pursue?
Book length project seems to me like a lot to bite off. I have written articles and give presentations about different, like, focused pieces of Shreveport music history. I can imagine one day kind of pulling all that stuff together in a more complete work. We'll see. Right now, I'm actually proofreading a guy's dissertation that he just wrote recently. And again, here's a case of someone from outside Shreveport doing work on Shreveport music history, a guy from Memphis, John Shaw, who wrote a dissertation about black music in Shreveport from like 1948 to the 1980s. And it's a great piece of work and piece of scholarship, and I know he hopes to eventually get that published one day. So that would be awesome if that comes to light. And yeah, right now I'm just trying to give him some feedback on it. It's like 500 pages long, and I'm on page 250 or something like that.
And how did he decide on that subject?
Good question. That we would have to ask John that, because I know he worked in the music industry in Memphis and was exposed to music from Shreveport, specifically kind of that Mirko record scene. And he was coming to Shreveport around the year 2000, which was before I got into this stuff. And he was interviewing a lot of people that I later met and interviewed, folks that we named off earlier, like Eddie Giles. Shoot, Reuben Bell, another huge Shreveport soul singer. Reuben has some amazing recordings out there. And Dory Grayson and just that whole Mirko record scene. John was interviewing, and, you know, quotes from those interviews show up in his dissertation. So...
And Blade, does he talk about the Blade brothers?
That should come up somewhere deeper into the dissertation that I have not got to yet, because I think I'm still in the early 70s. And I know Pastor Blade was doing stuff at that point.
And I'll give a quick shout out, because I really think, for those of you that don't know, Brian Blade, who's from here, is probably one of the 2 or 3 greatest jazz drummers in the world currently working. So yet another piece of
the Shreveport music puzzle
to be really proud of.
100%.
Well, Chris, is there anything else you want to... I know we've covered a lot of ground today. I so appreciate all your knowledge and expertise in this area. I could talk to you for hours upon hours, because I think it's really important, and I think I'd like to see us do more with this, because I think it would lift us up and make us feel better about ourselves. But are there other things you want to share today that...
I guess a couple of things that I would point to are just past projects that I'm proud of that I've worked on. One was I've written a couple of articles about 1920s and 1930s black jazz music from Shreveport. And that story is largely one of the Calanthian Temple and dances that they had there, as well as other nightclubs and ballrooms up and down Texas Avenue that were these black-owned businesses that were everything from lawyers' offices to oil companies to dentist offices to real estate or life insurance offices. And plugged into that neighborhood was entertainment. And I just got curious years ago. Okay, I worked with the Shreveport Sun newspaper microfilm at both LSU Shreveport's archives and at Southern University Shreveport's archives, largely because Willie Burton started collecting and saving that stuff, and then they made microfilm copies of it later on. Let me just dial up a reel of microfilm of the Sun starting in the 1920s, and see what I can find as kind of through lines of music history. And a lot of it was dances and music events going on up and down Texas Avenue. Not many people had really ever focused on jazz and swing of that time period on Texas Avenue. So I ended up looking at all of my notes that I compiled from looking at the Sun. And one of the threads that kind of ran through that was a music promoter who was named Ike McKinney, who I guess was promoting shows for maybe 8-ish years. I don't think it was quite a decade. Who then has this kind of mysterious death when he accidentally, or who knows how he ends up falling into a ditch, like a concrete ditch, and dying. But he's working with a whole bunch of local as well as touring black jazz groups, bringing them to Shreveport to play for audiences. And so I thought, let me write the story of Ike McKinney and all the musicians that he worked with. So that was published in a magazine or a newsletter journal that comes out of Tulane University in New Orleans. They have a jazz archives there. For a long time, they had the Jazz Archivist publication. So that appears there. And you can get to that online these days. If you just Googled Ike McKinney, Shreveport, 1930s jazz or something, Tulane, all that should get you there.
And do we have any audio recordings of anything jazz-wise on Texas Avenue in the 30s?
You have some examples of music groups from other cities, some from New Orleans, some from San Antonio, I think some from Kansas City, who are doing like a one-night stop performance in Shreveport, and they cut records. So yeah, there's actually one of those playlists on that blog. It's actually, here you can listen to songs from this time period and this style of music, jazz music from the 1920s and 30s. Yeah, and that's one of those mixes.
They were recorded in Shreveport while they were here.
Zero. None of those were actually recorded in Shreveport. It was just a touring band who made recordings at some point in their time, in their life. And I tried
and they had played in Shreveport.
And they had played in Shreveport.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about audio recording of anyone at Calanthian Temple? Or
zero audio recordings of that. And I tried to pick songs of, okay, they performed in Shreveport in, say, 1930, and they later cut a session in a different city that same year or close to it. Let me pick a song from that recording session. So it's somewhat reflective of what audience goers might have heard at that time. And so besides Ike McKinney, there is another guy a little bit later, I think this was in the late 30s, who is from Shreveport, a pretty mysterious figure whose name that he went by on his records was called 315 and His Squares, which I've never quite understood how he came up with that name. I wonder if it's a reference to dominoes, but I'm not 100% sure about that. That guy did make probably 8 or 10 recordings, and you can listen to those. He did not play at the Calanthian, but he played at other places up and down Texas Avenue. And his name is Dave or David Blunson or Blunston. It shows up different ways in different places. And he traveled up to Hot Springs to do a recording session to, record about, like I say, 10 songs or so. And then those were released at that time period. And he has this really great song called Saturday Night on Texas Avenue, where he talks about what someone would do visiting Texas Avenue, on the weekend, circa 1939, going to different bars or, hanging out with friends, listening to music. So there's one guy that you can hear who's actually from Shreveport. Yeah.
Well, and I told Robert Trudeau this recently. I had heard, I guess through Willie's books or things I'd read from you that, people like Duke Ellington may have played at the Calanthian or may have been in town. And I started doing some research and I found some articles of his orchestra being here, but he wasn't here himself. And then all of a sudden I came across an article in the Times. I shared it recently where it says Duke was actually here with his orchestra at Municipal on X date, and
Yeah.
that really made me, that was like an epiphany moment for me. I was like, wow, that's really cool. And
The Municipal, which opened in I think 1929, basically hosted a ton of top performers of their day, regardless of race. And shoot, a lot of it's music, but they were doing stuff at the Municipal that was like boxing or plays, stage plays. But yeah, some of those top tier musicians that you think of that often I think are kind of misattributed as having performed at some places around town. And it's like, they were so dang popular, they would fill up the Municipal, not some teeny tiny nightclub. And when you look at advertisements, it's like, okay, here's an ad for Louis Armstrong and his band playing at the Washington Erie Hotel or at a black nightclub on Texas Avenue, or here is someone like Duke Ellington performing at the Municipal to a segregated audience. Both black and white people are in the seats, but you have designated where you can sit. Or Cab Calloway performed at the Municipal, and yeah, I think of the Calanthian as more of like kind of like the second string or maybe even third string musicians who perform there, who sometimes then made their way up to top tier. But shoot, the folks who had a huge audience were performing at the Municipal, like the ones you're naming, yeah.
well, Chris, anything else?
Another project that I worked on years ago that I'm always finding little puzzle pieces that I think are interesting are a guitar player, evangelist guy named Reverend Utah Smith, who is from the Cedar Grove neighborhood. And he was born in the early 1900s and heavily involved in the Church of God in Christ denomination. And he first started out as like a preacher, and he was working with churches outside of Louisiana. I think he grew up in Shreveport and then moved away, and then would periodically come back to Shreveport to visit relatives. But Utah ends up moving to Connecticut for a while, and he is doing like these tent revivals and playing music at them and doing like faith healing, laying hands on people to cure them as part of this elaborate event. But he's playing guitar, and like I said, he starts off as a preacher and then starts doing music stuff too. But he was very much like a unusual attraction in the areas that he was living in the Northeast. He ends up being invited as part of that 1950s kind of folk music interest to be a guest performer at the Museum of Modern Art in New York as like a one-time performance with Utah Smith and his like choir members coming to perform. And it's like this black church is giving this performance, doing this like blisteringly loud electric guitar playing that Utah Smith was known for. And this group of singers behind him. And Utah Smith released some of his own records himself. He worked with a couple of small record labels to release songs. He also worked with that label up in Chicago, Checker Records, to release a record. But holy moly, Utah Smith sounds like wild guitar playing meets sacred music, gospel, sermon lyrics. And it's really, really interesting. And probably as I was getting interested in local music history, I had heard of him before. And there's like a compilation CD that probably came out in the early 2000s of his recordings. And it was like, wow, this guy sounds really interesting. And later on, he ends up founding a church in New Orleans in the Callio neighborhood and ends up operating that two-wing temple Church of God in Christ in New Orleans for, I think, 15 or 20 years. And he would sometimes come back to Shreveport to do performances and like tent revivals around town. And I just thought, man, this guy is really interesting. And I just heard through the grapevine, I can't remember how this was, but a friend of mine was doing a radio show, and he specializes in gospel music. And I just emailed him. We weren't friends initially. And I was like, hey, Kevin, I'm from Shreveport. I really like your radio show. Keep up the good work. And he wrote back, and he was like, oh my gosh, you're in Shreveport? We're working on a book on this musician who's originally from Shreveport, who's still buried, who is buried there. And as part of the book, can you just go to the graveyard and take a picture of his tombstone so that we can include that in the book? And I think I also had already done a lot of that Shreveport Sun newspaper research. So I had a handful of references that I passed along to the author of that book that got incorporated. And I drove out to the cemetery. I think I called the phone number first and got the got the coordinates for the grave, like row such and such, plot number, this and that and the other. And so I get out there, and it's like, I can't make sense of where this guy might be buried. But there's a person cutting grass out there, and I kind of flag him down, and we talk, and he's like, oh yeah, I can help you. You have the plot number. This will be easy. Okay, we just got to see what section. We got to count it off. Okay, let's go. And so I'm just following him, and he's like counting off the rows. And it's like this big reveal when we get here, like, and here he is. And it's just a bare plot of grass. And he's like, oh, I guess he doesn't have a tombstone. And it was like, wow, this guy who had led this really interesting life and was celebrated in different ways, he's just buried in an unmarked grave here. And so I took a picture of the grass and sent it to the guys who were working on the book, and the picture of the grass shows up in the book. And it mentions that he lies in this unmarked grave. And curiously enough, that book kind of made a splash for people into Black gospel music. And there's actually an Elton John song written about Utah Smith, and he mentions him laying in an unmarked grave as part of the lyrics. But probably a decade-ish went by, and it was always kind of rolling around in the back of my mind. And occasionally I'd find like another piece of the Utah Smith puzzle, like in a newspaper database, just searching for his name. It's like, oh, here he is doing this in some other city. Let me file this away. Here he is performing at the annual gathering of the Church of God in Christ members up in Memphis. Let me make a note of that. And it was like, man, I wonder what it would take to get this guy a tombstone. So again, I just picked up the phone and called that number of the office that like administers that cemetery. And I said, hey, what's the procedure for getting a headstone made for someone who doesn't have one? And they were like, if you want to pay for it, sure, that's fine, because that's helping us out, marking where someone is buried that otherwise there's no record of unless you have a sheet of paper. So I found out a price, and I think it was like maybe $700. I mean, it wasn't an astronomical figure. And so I just reached out to about 15 friends and said, hey, you want to pitch in? And people would be like, yeah, here's $25, here's $50, here's $100. And we just scraped that money together and came up with a design that basically just says his name, that he was a minister, that he was in the Church of God in Christ, and that he was, I think we put on there, electric guitar evangelist. Because this electric guitar playing is really pretty unique for that time and that style and that kind of ferociousness to the sound. And then because his trademark song that he recorded multiple times was Two Wings, which is based on this biblical scripture reference. And he even did some of his performances wearing these homemade giant wings that he would strap to his back and walk up and down the aisles of the church with a guitar, playing electric guitar, but having a really long cord that would plug into an amplifier. So, and shouting about two wings. So we stuck two wings on that tombstone as well, and had a ceremony just acknowledging that we were doing this. And I remember we had a gathering at the cemetery, and folks from the Shreveport Sun newspaper came out and covered it. And holy moly, it was like the Shreveport Sun is such a gold mine for the history of Black Shreveport. And there's stuff about Utah Smith in there when he's coming back and performing doing tent revivals or buying time, like 15-minute increments on the radio station to like advertise that he's here. That shows up in like the program log of the radio station, that it's like, hey, we got the news at this hour, then we got Reverend Utah Smith who's, on for 15 or 30 minutes or whatever. And yeah, just piecing together that story through local newspapers that thankfully are now more accessible than ever through databases online, or go to the Broadmoor Library in town. They're the genealogy library. They can help you tap into this stuff. Your tax dollars at work. This stuff is out there. You just got to, devote the time to explore it.
I love that you did that with Utah, and I need to go see the headstone at some point. And
Carver Memorial Cemetery, just south of town. I mean, it's in town, South Shreveport.
Is the Sun, I use newspapers.com a lot. I would imagine you've delved in there. Is the Sun archived on there?
The old back issues of the Sun are not available online, but you can get to the microfilm at a handful of places around town. Like I mentioned, LSU, Shreveport's archives, as well as their microfilm department, and also Southern University in Shreveport, their archives and microfilm collection there. Yeah, that's how you can access the old issues of the Sun. Okay. Yeah.
Well, Chris, I so appreciate you. It's great to see you. It's been a long time, and you're just a wealth of knowledge, and I appreciate you sharing it today. Anything else you want to mention?
I think we've covered everything, and yeah, my mind rolls back around to like those 3 songs that people might have heard from Shreveport, and we hit on that Leadbelly topic for a while, but shoot, Jimmy Davis has a fascinating story. Before he's governor, he's working as the clerk of court downtown and interacting with blues musicians and making recordings with them, and then buying the rights to You Are My Sunshine, and just that thing skyrockets with him popularizing it. I've heard before that that's one of the most recognizable songs in the world, like beyond Happy Birthday as a song, You Are My Sunshine. Or like that song Susie Q that Dale Hawkins recorded is like the big 3. Hey, if you've heard these songs, you've heard of something connected to Shreveport music history. Yeah, and there's so much more out there. I mean, I continue to learn more. I imagine the rest of my life I will be continuing to collect pieces of the puzzle and records and interviews and photographs of folks who are part of this story. It's a really amazing and rich topic.
Well, so appreciate you, and I sure hope that's the case.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure coming down, reconnecting with you, being a guest on your show, and just highlighting some of the stuff that's right out there. So happy to do it. Thank you.